Hello there, and welcome to the final screencast that I'm going to do for you for this anthology. Well, you might get a few more from me, but let's see what happens. So the final poem I'm going to talk to you about is Home Thoughts from Abroad by Robert Browning. Now, Robert Browning is a seriously famous poet. He's one of the Romantics, and he wrote a lot of poetry about man and his psychological link to the world. So he's a very famous poet. Reading about his life and the way he lived and what he wrote and the relationships that he had is not going to be difficult in the slightest. So off you go, do a quick Google search and inform yourself, please. What you need to know specifically to the reading of this poem is that when he wrote this poem, he'd been in Italy for some time with his wife Elizabeth Barrett Browning, also a famous poet, arguably more famous than him during their lifetimes. And when he wrote this poem, he was in Italy, living with his wife in a self-imposed exile almost, because his wife's father objected to the marriage, and rather than try and argue and persuade and all those other very cool Englishy skills, Browning and Elizabeth Barrett eloped. That means they ran away to get married, and they ran away to Italy and got married. So they stayed away from England for many years in order to stay away from the ire and fury of her family. So Browning, most famous for writing poetry about people and the way they think. This one's different though, because it focuses on the nature of spring in England and so on. I want you to think a bit more about that. Let's go. So, stanza 1. Oh, to be in England now that April's there, and whoever wakes in England sees some morning unaware that the lowest boughs on the brushwood sheaf round the elm tree bole are in tiny leaf, while the chaffinch sings on the orchard bough in England now. Now, you'll notice when I read to the punctuation, because the meaning of the sentiments here won't actually make sense if you stop at the end of each line. So if I take, for example, line 3 and 4, and I say, and whoever wakes in England sees some morning unaware that the lowest boughs and brushwood sheaf round the elm tree bole are in tiny leaf. It just, although the rhyme works a bit better, it really doesn't make sense. So whenever you're reading poetry, you should always read to the punctuation, not the line end, but be aware of the bounce of the rhythm. Okay, so the rhyme scheme's nice and straightforward. So we've got England, England, there, unaware, sheaf, leaf, bough, now. So you've got alternating rhymes and then 2 rhyming couplets at the end. So who is in England? That's the question. Well, not the person who's saying the poems and not the poetic voice itself. And what's the implication of starting with an O? Okay, so is that woeful? Is that sad? Is that melancholy? And if you don't understand the natural terms here, like brushwood sheaf and elm tree bole, or chaffinch for that matter, which is a type of bird, I'll give you that for nothing, look them up, because you kind of need to appreciate how much nature he's talking about in this section. Now, stanza 2. I've split stanza 2 into 2 parts, and I'll explain why in a little while, but first of all let's read it. So, and after April when May follows, and the white throat builds, and all the swallows, hark! Where my blossomed pear tree in the hedge leans to the field and scatters on the clover blossoms and dewdrops at the bent spray's edge. That's the wise thrush. He sings each song twice over, lest you should think he never could recapture the first fine careless rapture. Now, the rhyme here, let's see what we've got. Follow, swallows, hedge, clover, edge, over, hedge, edge, clover, over, recapture, rapture. So we've got a combination of alternating rhyme, so the ABAB section, and rhyming couplets again. Is there anywhere that you can think of where you might find this kind of rhyme scheme? We'll come back to that, but is it familiar to you in any way? I want you to think about those possessive pronouns. So, my pear tree. That's the wise thrush, she says. Is there a sense of recognition? Is Browning, or Browning's poetic voice, currently reflecting on something familiar and something specific, rather than thinking about, oh, isn't England wonderful in the spring when all the grass is getting green and all the trees are blooming and starting to grow small leaves and when everything is waking up. But he's thinking about something very specific. It is, as my little orange box tells you, a sense of recognition in the use of the word that's. That's the wise thrush. It's almost like he's pointing at it with his imagination and his memory. So think about what that could intimate to you. And I want you to look at the way that the words are used here as well. There's lots of alliteration, there's lots of internal rhymes in the line, there's lots of double beat words, and there's a very good ti-dum-ti-tum pattern. Think about it. Do you know what that connects with? And if you don't, hopefully very soon you'll have figured it out. So let's see. So the last part of stanza 2, I split this up because there's loads to say about this ending part, and although the last 2 slides on a page of poetry would be condensed together, I wanted to break them up so I could talk about a bit more about this. So let me read it to you first of all. And though the fields look rough with hoary dew, all will be gay when noontide wakes anew. The buttercups, the little children's dower, far brighter than this gaudy melon flower. Now, we've got 2 rhyming couplets there. Almost 4 rhyming lines, because you've got the W sounds in there, dew, anew, dower, flower. So there's a repetition of gentle, soft sounds. We've not got as many plosives in there as we might have expected to find when someone was talking about the explosion of life in spring, perhaps. So, and though the fields look rough with hoary dew. How many O's and OU sounds there are in there? There's an awful lot of assonance in there. Okay, that's a repetition of vowel sounds in the middle of words. Though the fields look rough with hoary dew. There's that O sound over and over and over again. And then all will be gay when noontide wakes anew. So we've got the A's there too. Lots of vowels being played with and lots of rhyming couplets. There's a lot of imagery in this particular section. So a hoary dew is the kind of dew that almost looks like somebody's iced the grass. So it's not frost, it's not white, but it's like a beautiful web of glistening dew, and it's so heavy that sometimes you can see like more thin leaves and larger pieces of grass perhaps bending under the weight of the water. Or he's targeting in on spring. So remember, spring in England isn't that hot. It's not until later on in the summer that it really gets hot, so it takes all the way through till midday for that dew to lift. But that water is refreshing, the water and the warmth and the sunlight. If you go back to your science, you know that all of that water and all of that sunlight is going to make the little chloroplasts super duper happy, and there's going to be an awful lot of energy being created inside those flowers. So when you think about it, although he's not necessarily commenting on the science, he's noticing the effect of that science. Okay, so the photosynthesis that's going on has woken up the world. And he talks about the dew and he talks about the sunshine, but he doesn't go any further than that because he's not writing about science. He's writing about how wonderful nature is in England in the summertime, in the springtime, sorry. Okay, so think about whether you have ever put a buttercup under someone's chin to see if it shines yellow and then they like butter. If you've not done that, I suppose you could probably find the film somewhere on YouTube showing it, but ultimately what you need to look at is the way that the buttercup, the little children's dower, so little children's game, far brighter than the gaudy melon flower. It's a really interesting choice of word with gaudy, this gaudy melon flower. So he looks around him and realises that the buttercups and the fields and everything else that have come to life in his imagination, they're not there. He's sitting in this gaudy melon flower. So if you look up the images of the melon flower on Google, which I did just before I started making this screencast, they're quite dry looking and quite spiky and almost washed out in their colour. So they don't look fresh and vibrant and alive in the way that Browning is imagining England to look in the spring. Where he is in Italy, in April in Italy, it's already hot, there's lots of flowers, it's already dry and dusty. So thinking about all of those things, perhaps this isn't necessarily a poem about nature after all. Perhaps this is a poem about jealousy. So, just to summarise, because this is really quite straightforward, this poem initially presents itself as a celebration of spring in England, but it's more of an expression of loneliness from someone who is far away from home and is reflecting back on what he's left behind. That's the thrush, my pear tree. Think about that. He's thinking very specifically of a certain place. He's not just reflecting on the whole of the English countryside. If you haven't got to it already, the form that it's echoing is a sonnet. It's much longer, and the rhyme scheme is a bit too irregular, and it's not always in the pentameter that we'd expect it, or in the bounce that we'd expect to see it in terms of poetic rhythm, but it's very similar. It even has a turn where the tone changes, just like a sonnet has. Usually either after 6 lines or 8 lines, the direction of a sonnet changes, and this does something very similar too. So one could easily say that Browning's playing with the form of a sonnet here to indicate love. The sonnets are often used as love poetry, so when we see that very regimented form, we instantly think, okay, so this is a love poem to or about something, and perhaps that's what Browning's going for here. He's writing a poem which is to tell you that he loves England and he misses it, but also to reflect on the psychology of the poetic voice, and to think about how the poetic voice is damaged by being away from its home. There is elements of the romantic poetry in here, romantic with a capital R, so it's not all hearts and flowers and chocolates from Thornton's. Romantic poetry is all about nature. You need to do a little bit of reading about that if you're going to really engage with the context of this poem. But I'll leave you with this. The last line is really weird. Okay? The melon flower tells you that he must be somewhere warm and tropical, but he calls it gaudy. Look up the word gaudy and reflect on the reasons why a poet might use that to describe a melon flower. We think of melons, we think of fruit and sweetness and tropical temperatures and so on. So why say gaudy? Gaudy is not classy. Okay? That's me done. So hopefully you've understood a little bit more about this poem, and you've thought a little bit more about the elements in the lines. But hopefully you've gone over it and you've noted in the alliteration, you've noted in the rhyme scheme, you've looked up words you don't understand, made sure that you have a sense of what the meaning of the poem is itself. After that, in class and with your teacher, you will go through ways of understanding this poem and ways of identifying the meaning and how these devices have created that meaning. Have a nice evening, or a nice day, or a nice morning, or a nice whatever it is you're doing, and I hopefully will produce some more screencasts for you very soon.